Bush.
And hello, I'm Dr. Tara Peters, and we are the Leadership Doctors. And today we have an amazing thought leader with us today, Dr. Barry Schwartz, widely published, and we're just really looking forward to the conversation today. Barry is a psychologist and a Professor Emeritus from Swarthmore College, and he's now currently faculty at the Haas School of Business. So welcome, Dr. Schwartz.
It's a pleasure to be with you in these interesting times.
Absolutely. We're very glad to have you to get your perspective. And I think that as a part of our level setting, it'll be really helpful to our audience for you to talk a little bit about your professional journey and the work that you're currently doing.
Sure. So, you know, I spent my entire life in academic institutions. I applied to Swarthmore College, a small, very selective school outside of Philadelphia. In my last year of graduate school, they offered me the job. I took it. I spent 45 years there and then retired and moved to the West Coast to be closer to family. And so I'm one of these people who thinks change is bad. If you find something that's good, stay the hell there, which is what I did. And I had a wonderful career, most entirely teaching undergraduates. Swarthmore has no graduate program. Now I'm teaching graduate students, MBA students. So, you know, my journey has really been, my initial training was in the psychology of B.F. Skinner, a very, very central figure in psychology half a century ago, now not so much. And he had an idea about what motivates people, which is that it's really all about rewards and punishments, which if you work in the business world doesn't seem particularly far-fetched, right? If you want to get people to do stuff, dangle the right incentives in front of them and they'll do anything. They'll run in front of a moving train. Well, that was Skinner's view. And I thought it was simply a very impoverished view of what people cared about. So I spent most of my career teaching and writing about the limitations of that view, which is not to say that you can't manipulate people by manipulating incentives, but that's sort of the least significant and least interesting part of human beings. And if you're creating an organization, whether you're trying to manage a university or an industrial plant or a service company, relying on incentives is virtually guaranteed to get the worst that people have to offer. There are smarter and dumber ways to do it, but even the smart ways to do it really undersells what people are capable of giving. So that's been I wrote a book, several books about this over the course of 25 years. The most recent book is one called Why We Work. It's a very short book. You can read it just on a few trips to the toilet. And it's sort of there it's an attempt to spell out why it matters to people that they have meaningful and productive work to do. And I just want to say that the current crisis really illustrates a lot of the points that I tried to make in that book, because we are now celebrating as heroes people who are, just 2 months ago, were invisible. Nobody noticed the people who delivered stuff to groceries. Nobody noticed the people who cleaned hospitals. Nobody noticed the people who manufactured supplies without which we couldn't survive. They were just in the background. They were insignificant people. And now they're heroes. Well, my view is that they were heroes then too. They were heroes that we were insufficiently appreciated, insufficiently compensated. And if we took the time and trouble to inspire them by making it clear how much we appreciated the significance of what they did, they would do what they do even better. They're doing it now because it's a desperate circumstance. When the desperate circumstance ends and people go back to ignoring them, what's going to happen? So one of my hopes is that we won't go back to ignoring these people. We will appreciate how important they are, how valuable they are, how committed they are to doing their jobs well, and that will last even after the pandemic subsides.
Oh, very well said. And I just want to say for those who are watching that as Tara and I wrote our book, and even in the early stages as we were conceptualizing some of our ideas, we did have an opportunity to read Why We Work. And really thinking about many of the things that Barry was offering in terms of causing us to really scratch our heads and think, well, what are the things we're doing inside of organizations, and why are we doing those things as it relates to the motivation of people? And so you began talking about your sense of what's happening, the way we're now noticing these folks that we refer to as essential workers, not even a phrase we probably had 2 months ago, but such a powerful phrase. And I'm sure, Barry, in your talking to people, in what you're watching, in what you're reading, you've had some thoughts that we'd love for you to share with us about what leaders should be paying attention to and what leaders ought to be focused on in terms of leading their people during this time of the pandemic. And so what ideas would you like to share with us and with our audience?
So it's a great question. And let me answer it a little bit indirectly. The book I wrote before Why We Work is a book about wisdom. And in that book, I describe an example of, this is work done by a colleague of mine named Amy Resniewski, who studied hospital janitors in a major academic hospital. And most of them, they have a long list of duties that they have to perform, all of them obvious: empty trash, wash floors, blah, 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 blah. And most of them punch the clock, go down the list, and then they punch out and their day is done. But there are some, a minority, who think that the list of the job description is the beginning of their job, not the end, that their job really is to do whatever is needed to serve the mission of the hospital. So they are there to ease suffering and cure disease in the same way that the doctors and the nurses are. And so they're asking themselves every minute of every day, what can I do to be helpful? This patient, big patient, needs to be turned so they don't get bed sores. It's not in my job description. The nurse can't do it. Let me see if I can help her. This patient is really depressed. How about if I change the paintings on the wall so it feels like progress is being made, things are changing? None of this part of the job description, but all of it part of what they construe as their jobs. Now, the problem is that these people are invisible. They're not just invisible to the patients, they're invisible to the people who run the hospital. They're the lowest paid, the most easily replaced. And so what I would do if I were leading an institute, I talked about this at a talk I gave in Texas, actually. And one of the people in the audience is a CEO of a hospital chain. Who knew? And he came up to me after the talk and he said, I'm going to make sure that we have hospital janitors on our boards. Now, did he actually do that? I don't know. My guess is he was inspired for 5 minutes and then he went back to business as usual. But I would say that if you think that workers in general are essential, not dispensable. Workers are not interchangeable parts. We create a system that makes them interchangeable parts in the service of efficiency, in quotes, which basically means profitability. When we do that, we do gain a little bit of profitability, and maybe we reduce the retail price of the goods and services, but we give up a lot. And it's not obvious that we're giving up a lot until something unusual happens. And then you need to call on these people and they're not there, or they're not motivated. They're just going to punch the clock and do their job. And if you got a problem, that's on you. And so my view is that you should think of yourself running an organization as being the steward of all the stakeholders in the organization, from the top to the bottom, including the people who take advantage of your services or goods and the community that's affected by whatever your operations are, and live that vision. Not just a speech at the annual meeting that everyone dismisses because it's not carried out in the day-to-day practices of the organization, but a speech at the annual meeting that then gets filtered down into every aspect of the way the company operates. My guess is that in the end, it will not even hurt profits. It'll probably make organizations more profitable because you'll have people doing much better work. But even if it did hurt profits a little bit, that's a price that's well worth paying to get the kind of attention and care and concern from the people we interact with that we want and reasonably expect. So I would say pay attention to the invisible people in your organization in a way that matters.
You know, that's really powerful, Barry, about paying attention to people, people that are not necessarily seen, people that are not necessarily on your radar, but recognizing how important they really are to your work. And really the pandemic really has, I think, crystallized the fact that people at all levels of your organization are really important. And in particular, those folks that maybe you thought of as being roles being less meaningful or important, but actually at the end of the day, if they don't happen, if they don't produce, if they don't show up, then the other kinds of things that you need to have happen don't actually take place. So I think that there's already some advice and wisdom that you've been sharing in that perspective. And so if you were consulting, and kind of, we're going to pull on you a little bit more for our audience, to think that in addition to kind of what you shared there around paying attention to those that are invisible in your organization, what other advice, if you were consulting with an organization, whether it was that hospital CEO or another entity around, what would be your advice right now for a leader during the pandemic? And you maybe want to extend that and think about, you know, after the pandemic, given all of this talk about, you know, revitalizing the economy and reopening. So we'd like to get your take on that.
Well, you know, I think it's a dangerous business to make predictions about what the world is going to look like when the dust settles. People make such predictions with great confidence. I have no confidence that I know what April 20th, a year from now, is going to be like. So that said, what I will make this prediction: the world is going to be different, and there's an opportunity once we recover from the acute and very disastrous consequences of this. There's an opportunity to make the different actually better. And in my view, one way to do that is to be less driven as a nation, as a society, by efficiency, and more driven by usefulness, importance, and value to society. We should all be willing to forego a little bit in our 401ks and a little bit in our annual bonuses and share prices and what have you, in order to play the role that we should be playing in contributing to making society better. And you know, one of the things I try to suggest is that everybody, no matter how menial your work, menial in quotes, there is a sense in which every transaction you engage in is an opportunity to make the world better, at least in a small way. Anyone who comes into your shop in the mall has a problem. That's why they're in there. If you do your job well, you've solved their problem. You encounter 100 people a day in your shop, and so you have made 100 people's lives better. Now, how many people do you think work retail in malls who think that that's what they're there to do? They are there to make the lives of 100 people better every day, by not overselling them, by giving them what they need, by sometimes convincing them that they don't actually need what they need, by treating them with respect, by hearing what their problem is. At the end of the day, you have improved 100 lives. What an extraordinary achievement. And I think there are very few jobs that don't provide that opportunity. But most people who do these jobs, that actually taking advantage of that opportunity, is shut down. Because the only thing that matters is how much crap you manage to get out the door of your store in the course of your work shift. So I think this might get us to slow down, catch our breath, envision a model of economic activity in which the GDP isn't the sole, GDP is not the measure of productivity. Instead, the measure of productivity is, I don't know what to call it, GDH, gross domestic happiness. How much is our activity improving the well-being of the people we transact with? And if that means taking a bit of a hit in profits, it's worth it. Now, the problem, of course, is that shareholders are interested in how profitable you are because all they care about is that the share price goes up. And so you have to have people who don't feel they are completely beholden to the whims and the desires of shareholders. Can that happen? It can happen. The ideology of our society has gone entirely in the opposite direction. This may get us to think a little bit more carefully about what is really important, the stuff we have completely taken for granted in American society. And maybe we'll decide that increasing shareholder value is a nice thing, but it's not the most important thing. And then you change the way you lead your organization accordingly. So I have some optimism that this will clear away a lot of brush that will enable people who lead organizations to think more imaginatively about why they get up every morning.
When I think about the notion of GDH, gross domestic happiness, I think not only about the service to others that you're going to make happier and help live happier lives, but also the happiness of the employees in the workplace. And of course, this is a lot about the work that you have done and the work that Tara and I have done in our business and the message of our book, The Demotivated Employee. And so I wonder if a lot of the things you've shared with us already, I think would certainly translate into this, but I wonder if you could give leaders a couple of tips. If right now you are worried your employees are not as motivated as they used to be, maybe it's recent, maybe because of the pandemic, maybe they were already slumping in their motivation. Of course, the data suggests that 7 out of 10 people are disengaged at work at this point in time, right? So if you are speaking to a group of leaders, so what advice would you give them about tips they could take now if they suspect people are losing motivation?
Well, so in this little book, Why We Work, I have some suggestions that are less about tips going forward, but more about what it is that makes work good. And I think there are several ingredients. One is doing work that is actually engaging, that challenges. Another is feeling like you've accomplished something, that at the end of the day, something about the world has made progress as a result of your efforts. Most important, feeling like what you do is meaningful, which in my mind, mostly, not always, but mostly means has an impact on other people. Now, since I think virtually all the work that everyone does has an impact on other people, that shouldn't be so hard. Another is feeling that you have some control over what you do in the course of your workday. You know, this drive to efficiency in God only, I can't even imagine what fulfillment centers are like at Amazon or call centers. It's just about how many calls you take in the course of an hour, not how many problems you solve. So give people some control over how they do their job. Show them that you trust them. Show them that you believe that they are actually after the same objective that you are after. They're not going to shortchange you. The more discretion and autonomy you give people, the more they will earn it. And lastly, be clear about what the mission is. You know, how do you answer the question, what value do you add to the world? You meaning not you as an individual, but you know, your entity. What value does your company add to the world? Do your employees know this? Do they know how much this matters to you? Do they know what role they play in adding that value? If you pay attention to communicating this and making it clear that you trust people to do the best they can to provide that value, I think you will find people getting much more satisfaction out of the work they do, even if it's relatively menial work. You know, a pediatrician, take a pediatrician, the high status job, 98% of what a pediatrician does is the same old, same old. Calming down anxious parents, giving vaccines, telling the parents it's okay, it's just a cold, they'll be fine. It's the same damn boring thing over and over and over again. And once in a while, it really is a zebra, not a horse. Once in a while, something weird and rare shows up and your expertise matters. So how does a pediatrician show up for work every day? You think what they do is any less mundane than what the janitor does? No, it's not. But what's obvious is the role they play and the respect they get for playing that role in society. And so they do the same old, boring 90% of the time stuff, knowing how much they're valued. It shouldn't be that hard to show the people who clean up how much they're valued. You want people who go into hospitals to come out better, not sicker. If janitors don't do their jobs, and I'm not even talking about the pandemic, before the pandemic, there's an enormous amount of hospital-based infection. If janitors don't do their jobs, you are as likely to leave the hospital worse as you are to leave the hospital better. Does anyone make it clear how essential the role is that they play in enabling the hospital to achieve its mission? Not that I've heard, but if it was obvious to you that you are the line between sickness and health for most of the patients who are weak, vulnerable, susceptible, then I think they'd be inspired to do their jobs well, even though mostly they're doing the same thing day after day. It's okay to do the same thing day after day if the thing has intrinsic value. So I would say, if I were running an organization, I would do everything I could to make sure everybody in it knew why they were there and why they were valued, and that they were trusted. This is not a very American way to organize workplaces.
So as you were talking, Barry, I began to think about how you spent your career in higher ed. And so you've been with undergraduate students for 40 plus years, and now with graduate students in the MBA program there. So your life has been filled with learning and watching people grow and develop. I imagine that, bright-eyed, 18-year-old coming into your classroom at Swarthmore. Now you've got adults who are in varying stages of their career. And so we think it would be really helpful to our audience for you to share insights around, what are the kinds of things if someone is, wanting to one day become a leader, or they're currently in a leadership role, but they want to have additional opportunity, what would you say to them in terms of what they ought to be doing to grow and to develop themselves?
Well, so I think there are two key ingredients. One is humility, and the other is curiosity. Take a look over the shoulder of the person next to you and ask, what is that person doing? And what role does that play in the organization? And what can I learn from that person? That's the main thing. What can I learn from that person? And there are a lot of people in organizations who have plenty to teach. Unfortunately, many of the people who supervise them don't think they have anything left to learn. And so humility and openness to being educated from the most unexpected sources is a way to have it sort of happen by accident, that you become more and more capable of leading larger and larger chunks of the organization. You need to have specific expertise. Some amount of tunnel vision is necessary, but it's a catastrophe to have a bunch of siloed people, all of whom know everything about one small thing and nothing about the organization as a whole. So if you're running an organization, I think you want to make sure the people just one notch below you have enough room to breathe in their work schedule that they can be curious. That they're not working 18 hours a day just to do the job that you've given them. They have time to find out what other people are doing, and that they can afford to admit ignorance without worrying that it's going to cost them their position. Saying I don't know should be a virtue, not a liability. Not all the time, but at least some of the time. So I would say that be humble, and regard every interaction with another person as a chance to take a course at Swarthmore College, a little mini course at Swarthmore College or at Haas. I've always loved, when I taught at Swarthmore, the classes were mostly small. And, you know, the students, they were kids, they didn't know anything, but their naivete almost guaranteed that they would ask questions that were really good questions that I had never thought about. And I've been thinking about this stuff my whole life. And this 18-year-old comes at me with something and I go, huh, that's a good question. Let me get back to you. Now, a lot of the questions were dumb, but every now and then there would be really a stunning question that comes out of, you know, both curiosity, intelligence, and naivete. So there's a lot that we have to be taught by people who you would think know less than we do.
Great advice, Barry. And I was picturing the journey of the typical 18-year-old who tends to know it's their job to be curious, and probably has more humility at that stage of their life. They're willing to admit their errors and carry on. And then something happens to us, right? As we climb the ladder, as we go through our careers.
It's actually happening already to 18-year-olds. There, you know, when I first started teaching at Swarthmore a long, long time ago, everyone just took it for granted that when they got their degree, they'd be fine. There would be jobs aplenty waiting for them. People would be knocking on their doors. And so they took full advantage of what Swarthmore had to offer. Starting, I don't know when, in the late 90s, maybe, a little later than that, all of a sudden, people came no longer taking it for granted that they'd be fine. So they became much more goal-directed, much more focused. What should I major in? What courses should I take? What's the path? What's the career path that will put me on? And so that you could see the blinders starting to appear. And it was because they couldn't take professional success for granted anymore, simply because they had gotten into this very selective school. So I think that kids are less curious now and more instrumental in their educations than they were. And it doesn't, you know, no doubt graduating with a high 5 or 6 figure debt that you're going to have to repay contributes to this excessive focus on being able to make a living as soon as I graduate. So we managed to kill a lot of that curiosity even in the best undergraduates. Over the course of my career. And that sort of makes me sad. And the MBAs, it's even more true. You know, these are wonderful people. They're much less interested in getting rich than they are in bringing clean drinking water to sub-Saharan Africa or controlling malaria. You know, they all want to start a non-governmental organization that's going to provide public services better than the government can. So their hearts are very much in the right place, but they're also extremely goal-directed and career-focused. Now, you know, they've been out for a while. They're in their 20s. They're trying to start a family and have a grown-up life. So I understand it, but it's a little saddening to see how much less curious people are now than they were 30 years ago, when everyone just assumed that they were going to live better lives than their parents did.
So perhaps one little silver lining in this period of time that we're all in, which is far more self-reflecting than maybe other periods of time. So we as a whole society are taking a look at some things, and maybe this is one of the things that people will begin to check, and we might see a shift in this, hopefully for the better. Barry, thank you so much for all of your thought-provoking insight. It has been really interesting to hear your view on what's going on now, as well as in general about leadership and about making workplaces great and paying attention to the folks that maybe are invisible in organizations. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and keep up the good fight. As I said, I think there is a small chance that this will turn out to produce social transformations that really make this a better society than the one we had when all of this started. There'll be a lot of suffering on the way. I don't want to minimize that, but
yeah.
We've been listening to Patrick Lencioni, and one of the things that he said is that we can emerge better and stronger or we can have the absolute opposite to take place. And so, but it will be some intentional choices that we make to emerge better. And
Let me just say one last thing, and that is a lot of people who lead organizations now are putting fingers in the dike. They are encountering really catastrophic situations that require immediate response. And I get that. You want to make sure that your organization has a tomorrow. And you worry about that before you worry about a year from now or 5 years from now. But given that, it's still probably worth it to ask, when I put my finger in this hole in the dike, what's that going to mean for the company 3 years from now? When I put my finger in that hole in the dike, what's that going to mean? Because it may well be you can't plug all the holes. So you want to plug the holes that are going to lead, that have a shot at leading in the best way to a future that you'd like your organization to have. So I know that people are making emergency decisions now.
Yeah, well, as Tara was saying, and as you've been saying, I think we can be intentional about this, or we can just be hopeful about it. And our goal, I think all three of us share in this, is to create enough insight and a conversation with people to be intentional about it. And so if you enjoyed listening to our conversation with Barry, and if that got you thinking about some things, we hope that you'll tune in to other episodes of Lessons from Leaders, where we have both executive leaders and thought leaders such as Barry who are sharing insight. And you can see some of those interviews, and more will be coming. They're posted on our website, theleadershipdoctors.com. Thank you.